From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Welcome back, Rendezvous with History listeners. I'm your host, Anthony Eames, and I'm pleased to be joined here today with Stephen F. Hayward, the Gaylord Professor of Public Policy at the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Steve, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be back with you guys, especially in person. We've done this remote once or twice, but this is always better.
So, I think it's fair to say that there's been a good amount of chatter lately about, are we in a new political era? Is this the MAGA era? Is this the Trump era? And plenty of smart people have plenty of things to say about that. I want to push us back in time a little bit and ask you a question about, what are the indicators? What are the signals to historians that suggest that one political era has closed and one has opened? You did some really great work on this for a favorite book of ours here at the Reagan Institute on the age of Reagan, first the fall of the old liberal order, and then the rise of the Reagan Revolution. What kind of sense do you get about political transition? How can you tell?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways to think about this and a lot of theories that are contested, but I tend to go with the theory that every generation or two, you will have a fundamental realignment in American politics, and one coalition or one party will displace the other as the more or less durable majority in the country. So, I titled my book in homage, so to speak, of Arthur Schlesinger's famous book, The Age of Roosevelt. That was several volumes, and in the New Deal revolution in politics made Democrats the majority party for two generations at least. And then Reagan sort of brought that to an end. Reagan in 1980, first of all, won a surprise election. I won't say surprise. People thought he might win, but it was a landslide. And then his subsequent landslide reelection brought over a lot of, as we call them then, Reagan Democrats. He brought over a lot of voters who had been Democrats for years, just as Roosevelt in the 30s brought over a lot of Republicans into the Democratic Party. So that's when you see that the tectonic plates of American politics shift. And I think we may have seen something like that here with the election, the re-election, non-consecutive terms of Donald Trump. It was supposed to be, flip a coin race, and Trump ended up winning it, not by a landslide in the popular vote, but by a comfortable margin. And I do like to remind people that although Reagan won, 44 states in 1980 and a huge electoral college landslide, his popular vote total, I think, was only 50.6%. And Trump's is going to be 49, maybe 50 when all the votes finally come in. So although Reagan won nearly 60% in 1984, the 80 election was close in its vote totals.
Yeah, and there were some polls leading up to that election that even showed that Carter would prevail, which is yet another data point on whether or not you can trust the polls. But
right.
Let's move on. Democrats are now in the midst of probably the most intense finger pointing after an election that I've seen from Democrats in a long time, and of course. Wasn't so long ago, the famed RNC autopsy after Romney's defeat in 2012, where there was some pretty vicious finger pointing. And it leads me to ask you, what happens to a party when they lose, well, in some cases decisively, and in some cases by the, by ever so slight margins? I mean, what is the standard kind of soul searching that you see in parties? Is there a normal process, or is it really kind of every cycle is unique?
That's also a tough question. The Democratic Party went through this in the 80s and early 90s because Reagan clobbered them twice. And then George H.W. Bush in 1988 won, 55% of the vote, a pretty strong victory. And in those days, I remember the New Republic magazine would run its what they called quadrennial recriminations issue. And it was always the finger pointing of why are we losing so badly? And, one of the figures who said it's because we're too liberal was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton said, this was, I say off the record, I mean to reporters, but on background, he was saying as early as 1988 about Jesse Jackson, who was the very far left figure of the party in the 80s. Bill Clinton said, I don't think we need to distance ourselves from Jesse Jackson. We need to disagree with Jesse Jackson, which of course then 4 years later, Clinton had that famous Sister Soldier moment where he said, this is way too radical and so forth. And Clinton was tough on crime and a conservative Democrat in some ways. Well, I read lately that Bill Clinton was saying during the campaign, never mind immigration and crime and inflation, which are, tough issues for Democrats right now, but this business about political correctness and wokeness is killing Democrats, and you need to get better about that. And we're seeing a lot of fighting about that since the election's over. And once again, I think the future of the Democratic Party is going to be another Clinton-like figure, another reform movement to say, let's figure out where the center of American opinion is and see if we can't move our party more in harmony with that. And I think, parties that lose, I remember writing this after George W. Bush was reelected in 2004. If the Democratic Party were a stock on the stock market, I'd buy it right now because it's undervalued, and they're going to come back. And 4 years later, Barack Obama won a solid victory, right? So parties ebb and flow. But if you ignore, and I think this was what happened in the 80s, if you ignore that the center of public opinion has moved to the other party, if you don't adapt to that, you will lose more elections.
Steve, I think you can buy stock now on Polymarket.
Right. Well, it's more like an option, but okay, right.
Well, look, we see after 64, the Goldwater campaign, right. You see the Republicans move a little more to the center. Of course, their next great realignment victory doesn't happen until 80, despite Nixon winning. You see it, the RNC autopsy suggested a different type of maybe more centrist or big tent conservatism. You can, make your argument about whether or not those directives have been followed. And now it seems that this battle over where Democrats should move, as you point out, likely is going to probably end up moving toward the center. So is that the common response then? If you lose, don't move to the more kind of radical edges or fringe edges of your party, move back to the center? Right.
Well, I should restate it this way. Elections like 1932 or 1980, or maybe this one, is that they recenter where the center is. In other words, the center moves. And so with Reagan, and really starting with Nixon in some ways, but certainly with Reagan, the center of American politics moved to the right. That was on a whole bunch of issues, persuasion. Of course, Reagan was a fabulously great candidate. And I think that has happened now. There's a reason why. Oh, by the way, the coalition assembled. So, Reagan attracted a lot of labor union voters, a lot of traditionally Democratic constituencies. He did okay with Hispanic voters. But, if you go back to 2013, and you referenced the famous autopsy, and my joke is, don't let morticians do an autopsy. The thing was, we're too mean on immigration, they said. And along comes Trump, who couldn't be any more bellicose about immigration, and yet he's gotten a near record share of the Hispanic vote for Republicans. Well, it turns out that maybe Hispanic voters aren't a monolith. They don't think the way the faculty clubs do. They don't like being called Latinx. There's lots of survey evidence on that. They hate it, in fact. But you can shows that voters are unpredictable, and sometimes they'll move in a certain direction, and you realize that direction is closer to the center of where the country is.
You mentioned faculty clubs, and our hope is Rendezvous with History is listened by some folks in a faculty club. But this raises the question about party intellectuals, or say movement intellectuals. What happens when the movement is defeated to the intellectuals, right? We just referenced Goldwater's campaign. That's a time of really some heavy intellectual stuff on the conservative side, with National Review, with other kind of affiliated Buckley-like groups. What happens to these kind of thought leaders when their movement seems to fizzle?
I think new ones come along. I mean, that can be overstated, but, the Goldwater movement brought to the fore in the Republican Party a lot of conservative intellectuals, some in the academy and some not. A lot of the people who wrote for National Review were professors, but many of them weren't. And on the Democratic side, I think what you saw in the 80s and 90s was sort of a new breed of liberal intellectual, sometimes on faculties like Bill Galston at the University of Maryland, I think is very good. He worked for Clinton. He's been around a long time, still writes every week in the Wall Street Journal, and worth reading, I think. Al Fromm started the Democratic Leadership Council. And then, on the Republican side in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had the neoconservatives came along to augment, I think, all the people that William F. Buckley had recruited. And so I think now, right now on the Democratic side, I think the most interesting figure is Rui Teixeira, an old-fashioned progressive. He's for universal health care, higher taxes, the old social democratic welfare state, but also says, boy, are Democrats getting everything wrong that matters to the middle class in America. And if they listen to him, they may get back in the game rather more quickly.
You mentioned some of these modern intellectual figures. It's always kind of struck me, Steve, the way you go about choosing your subjects for your books and for your biography. You have M. Stanton Evans,
right?
Henry Jaffa, Walter Burns. What drives you to select these types of figures?
Yeah, well, let me work backwards. My recent biography of M. Stanton Evans is because he was my first mentor out of college, and I worked for him, and a bunch of people said, you ought to have a biography, and the light bulb went off in my head, and I thought that would be fun, and I had great fun doing it. Likewise, I was a student of Harry Jaffa's in graduate school, and then I was a colleague of Walter Burns at the American Enterprise Institute. They had a famous feud that I won't get into at all right now, which I think was, but it turned on a lot of deep dish arguments in political philosophy. So you don't want me to get into this on a podcast. But so I thought, they died on the same day at the age of 95 after feuding for years and had once been friends in the 50s as graduate students. And I thought that's too much like Jefferson and Adams dying on the same day after they'd been bitter enemies in 1800. And I thought it was a chance to introduce to a more general but interested audience sort of a wider world of what I then called dissident political science. So I knew those two figures and thought it would make an interesting story. The Reagan case, I never knew Reagan. I just met him once or twice very briefly, but I grew up in California. So he was governor when I was 10 years old. And at the time I started taking up my serious interest in writing about him, not many people were working on him. Ed Morris was thought to have had the monopoly on it. And I thought, we're just going to need a lot of books about him. And I was just young and crazy enough to think, I'm going to write a couple of big books about him that were, I call it like contextual books, try to paint a larger canvas of the political context he moved in, because I think that's the best way to understand political leaders most of the time. Yeah.
Well, they are big books, but I can still recommend them. And let's get into this because when you first started working on those Reagan volumes, you pointed out there hadn't been much done on the Reagan presidency yet, or Reagan as a subject of biography even. Fast forward a few decades, there's been quite a lot. And there's two kind of new entries into this space on opposite ends of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. You have Max Boot in his new biography of Ronald Reagan, and you have the new motion picture out on Reagan, starring Dennis Quaid, and they really seem to hit these kind of two sides. One is Reagan laid the seeds for Trumpism and for MAGA and for kind of set the table for the election of a Donald Trump type figure, and the other is Reagan is the anti-Trump and represents this kind of the true essence of conservatism, that he is an antidote to polarization, that he's a man that brought the office to a higher level of esteem. And so these teams seem to be these kind of two trails of Reagan today. And, I'm wondering, someone who spent a lot of time at the Reagan Library, spent a lot of time in the mind of Reagan, What do you have to say about that?
Well, a lot. Let's work backwards and just do a couple comparisons between Reagan and Trump. I mean, on the surface, they both have this kind of show business background, right? Although I'd argue Trump was a greater global celebrity by the time he entered politics than Reagan ever was, right? The Trump brand is on buildings all over the world and so forth. And they both have that sense of humor that differs. I mean, I like to say the difference is Ronald Reagan was Bob Hope. He had that sort of style of set piece comedy and punchlines that were sometimes biting about liberals, but not ever, whereas Trump is Don Rickles, right? He's the insult guy, and audiences love it. Some of the times I sort of cringe at it a bit, but see why it works. So there's that on the surface. Below that, they do have this in common that's more serious, is they're both doubters of the conventional wisdom. And they both use their own original vocabulary to talk about public affairs and what's going on in the country and how things ought to change. And journalists and people in Washington are not used to that. Either one, you're supposed to, believe in climate change or talk about certain issues with a certain vocabulary, and he doesn't do that. Neither one of them did. With Reagan, it was more subtle. Reagan certainly was a more genial person. We like to say politics are more polarized now, and there are various measures by which that is true. But I think people forget, as we often do looking back, how often bitter the politics were in Reagan's time. I mean, there was a lustful hatred of him on the left. And I think the biggest difference, may come down to something as simple as social media and 24-hour news cycles. If we'd had Twitter and MSNBC and Fox News and all the other things we have now in the mid-'80s, I think the intensity of the normal partisan strife would have been just as bad then as it is now. So I think that's endemic to politics generally. Now, let me go one more level here, and then I'll pause and you can follow up. The issue map has changed with Trump. I mean, Trump says the NAFTA treaty, the trade treaty, was one of the worst ever. And, of course, that was a Reagan idea. Now, he didn't finish the treaty, but he pushed it along, and I still think it's a good idea. I am a free trader in principle, but I can see this has not worked the way we hoped and wanted it to. Now, of course, Reagan was a big backer of the NATO alliance, but of course, then we had a real ideological conflict in the world. We don't face an ideological foe these days, or at least not an expansionist one. The Chinese are not out trying to spread communism the way the Soviet Union did for decades. But we have rivals. But that calls for a different kind of foreign policy disposition. And Trump has reopened questions that, by the way, were percolating in the Reagan years. There were people in the Reagan years saying, Europe's getting a free ride. They're not spending enough on defense. And one of the lesser appreciated initiatives of the Reagan era was getting the Europeans to spend more on defense. And he had some success. So the sort of issue map has changed a little bit. And that's going to call for different responses, whether you're a person of Trump's particular temperament and style or not.
Let's talk about the political map. And let's actually talk about voters specifically. We've talked about this potential realignment, and I want to kind of drill down into actually the Republican coalition from say Eisenhower to Trump. I know that's a big task, Steve, but you're used to taking on big subjects. And so trace for me how you see that coalition has evolved and brought in different groups of people, different, demographics, whatnot, and how that maybe kind of sets the table for an issue set, say a Reagan presidency versus what we're seeing today.
Yeah, so I think if you go back to the Eisenhower years, he won two, not quite landslides, but very comfortable victories. And the Republican coalition then was mostly white, suburban, middle-class, professional people. You still did decently with the black vote, where blacks were allowed to vote. That's an important caveat. It would have done even better if they could have voted in the South in those days. And of course, the Hispanic vote in the 50s was tiny. I mean, the Hispanic population was really just Texas and California and, maybe Arizona, but the percentage was very small. But then you had ethnics, your immigrants from Eastern Europe, Jews, Poles, Czechs, all the Balkan countries, and they tended to vote Democratic. Labor unions, people belong to unions, which was 25%, I think, of the American workforce in the 50s. They voted heavily Democratic. So that coalition began to change very slowly, starting with Nixon, but has really started to head in Reagan and has now jumped into overdrive and flipped places in the age of Trump. So, for example, college-educated people, which was always maybe 15% of the electorate, voted heavily Republican. Nowadays, college-educated people, or I'm going to say 40%, I don't know the exact number, but they're now voting Democratic. Upper-income people always voted Republican. Party of the rich, we said, party of the country club. And nowadays, it may have changed in this last election, but for the last several cycles, the wealthiest areas in the country have been voting Democratic. And suddenly, the Republicans are attracting the working class, which now is a multiracial description. It's not just the white working class is the way it's often talked about, but that now includes an awful lot of Hispanics, an awful lot of African Americans, and everyone else. So the parties have flipped places, and I think that's, in one case, the working class has been ignored, or our policies have not worked very well for them. Those two overlap, right? It's hard to tell whether we've ignored them or just haven't figured out what to do about stagnant wages, about declining job opportunities. The old cliche was, not cliche, it was true, that you could have a high school education in Michigan, get a good job working at an auto company, retire with a nice pension, and that's not true anymore. Or it's true for many, many fewer people, and that's a problem.
So that's an interesting kind of, you've painted almost a continuity in that coalition.
Yeah.
Even, going back from Eisenhower all the way to today, the Reagan Democrat, of course, is a big phenomenon. And you've mentioned that maybe we're seeing I don't know if I've heard the term Trump Democrat quite yet, but
right.
We're clearly seeing some sort of voter shift happen. With that voter shift, have we seen a difference in how people view the office of the presidency itself? Not the person of the president, of course,
right,
but the office of the president. You've seen a lot of, someone like Jeremy Surrey has written about the impossible presidency.
Yes.
The job just too big. We've heard a lot over many decades about the imperial presidency. The job is deliberately too big. What is the difference in terms of how Americans see the office?
Boy, that's an important and troublesome question. I'm of the view of Gene Healy. You may be familiar with him. I forget the name of his book, but about the inflated presidency or something. But too many Americans think of the president as a miracle worker. And in response, candidates of both parties, I have to say, overpromise. And by the way, there's no greater overpromise than make America great again. I mean, who knows what exactly that means? I think there's some content to it. But the point is we're now used to presidents overpromising. But it is an office with limited powers, deliberately so, in our Constitution. And second, I don't think it's quite right to say the job's too big for any person. And I think that's one of the things Reagan proved is you still could have a successful presidency. People forget that when Reagan became president in 1980, first of all, people had little regard for him, intellectuals, the media, and a lot of politicians in Washington. How can a former actor possibly do this? They always seem to skip over that he'd been governor of California for 2 terms quite successfully. But the point is up to that point, we'd had all these presidencies that went badly. Nixon's run out of office and so forth. And the current of opinion was the job's too big for anybody. We've got to change the presidency, make it either more powerful formally, make it a single 6-year term, make it a parliamentary government, all kinds of reform ideas. All of those went away by the time Reagan finished his 2 terms in office and haven't come back. We've now had several 2-term presidencies that argue what you will about what they accomplished, but they accomplished this much. They maintained public support and legitimacy for their tenures in office. And so the problem now is people overpromise and people expect a lot from presidents, and so they're easily disappointed. And so although I think that it's possible that Republicans will, over time, keep most of the new coalition that Trump has assembled, it's easy to lose a lot of those voters too. So we'll just have to see.
Well, you mentioned this 2-term presidency idea, and of course, starting with Kennedy for reasons that obviously he would have preferred go differently. We didn't have a full two-term president until Reagan.
Right.
And, I'm always a little skeptical about applying a cyclical approach too much, but it could be that we may be seeing ourselves in this kind of one term. We know for a fact we're going to have a one-term president, right? From 2024 to 2025 to 2029,
right?
And so that'll mark a lot of single terms in a row.
Well, yeah, 3 single terms in a row, except this is so weird. I mean, we haven't had a non-consecutive president since Grover Cleveland in 1892. so our statistical set is pretty small. And let's remember that, after Cleveland, you had a Republican realignment that lasted for quite a long time, for, nearly 30 years till the Great Depression came along. So things depend a lot on events. I don't know. It's just a hunch here. I think this second term with Trump is going to be unique and unusual. I don't think it's going to be a typical second term, which often have their challenges and go badly. I think he comes in almost like a reset. Like the first term was a mulligan, to use a golf term, since he's a golfer. And I don't know. We're going to have to see how it all goes, but it could be something that we look back on 30 or 40 years from now as something quite unique and remarkable.
So data sets. Recently we had Professor Alan Lichtman on, the famous keys to the White House.
Right.
He predicted Kamala Harris would win this time around. That prediction we know today to be incorrect. You have a different view about, how you prediction might be too strong a word, but project the winner of any particular presidential election. And if you were to give your, I don't want to say keys, but if you were to give your template on how you judge who will be the winner of an election, what would that be?
Well, a couple things. I mean, I think the problem with his keys are our data set is just not very big. If you're really trying to do statistics on this, with one exception, not so much in his keys, but other academic political scientists, modelers do these fancy regression analyses. But my point is that normally, I think the best predictive models are the ones that say the incumbent party usually wins if unemployment is low and economic growth is in a positive direction, which it was for Biden. I actually wrote an article in the New York Post way back in January or maybe late last year saying Biden ought to be cruising to an easy reelection based on the macroeconomic data. The problem is you need to go under the hood a bit in some ways that you can't capture in keys or models. One of them is that the sort of economic health of the country may look great on the top line, but below the top line, it was not widely distributed. Inflation was clobbering a lot of people. Their wages were not keeping up. They weren't happy with that. Second, candidate quality makes a difference. Trump, say all about Trump, the guy has charisma in a big way. And, Biden's age was obviously a problem. You can have, take Lichtman's 9 keys or however many they are, or any of the others. And if you then try and run someone who's obviously unable to make it to election day, he's going to lose. And, people are going to talk forever about swapping out Harris too late and so forth, and that she was not a very good candidate. I think all that's true. So candidate quality counts for a lot. And that you can't quantify. I don't think there's any statistical model that can capture candidate quality. And I think that's more decisive at the end of the day. The other factor is important and, they're useful, but I think at the end of the day, candidate quality is the decisive factor.
Well, candidates spar with each other, Steve. And
right.
One thing I've known about you for some time is you spar with people in print and you spar with people in person. And you always, in print, can be pretty decisive, which isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing to get your arguments across strongly and authoritatively in print. But in person, you're always quite congenial in your sparring. How do you? What's your approach to sparring with those who disagree with you?
Well, gosh. I never try and compare myself to Reagan, except now I will. Reagan was that way in person most of the time. But, in his diary and his letters, you could see he could be really angry and bitter sometimes about the media. But part of his discipline was never wanting to show that. In my case, I'm kind of a genial person like Reagan. I like people, even people I don't agree with. And in person, I'm usually trying to persuade rather than defeat, like it's a boxing ring. I mean, a formal debate, yeah, you then do a little bit more of the pugilistic debating style. But and also it comes from being a classroom teacher. I've been, as I put it, an inmate at UC Berkeley the last several years, and I have a lot of progressive students. And what I want to do is engage them. And they've been some of my favorite students, by the way. And it's more fun to persuade people and have an exchange of ideas than it is simply to have a Twitter fight, right? I don't do Twitter fights anymore. I quit quite a while ago. I only tell jokes on Twitter or link to something interesting maybe, but there's no point. Nobody has ever won a Twitter argument, I think, right? We still can't give them up. So that's part of it is, I don't, Reagan was kind of I like to see the good in people person, and I'm a little more cynical than that, because sometimes I want to see the bad in people, but mostly I'm kind of that way too.
All right, well, I think it's time we wrap up with our Hints for History section, and Steve, I wonder, what is it that historians or political scientists, scholars, people who will look back on the past with an analytical view, what are some things they should be paying attention to right now?
Well, there's always too much to pay attention to. I think, though, if you're trying to think about any historical person, especially a person, if you're doing biography or some kind of analysis of a president or a secretary of state, I think there's two things that you ought to do by way of methodology. One is, I think you want to, the casual way of putting it is, you want to get inside that person's head. The more formal way of putting it, more serious way, is try and understand them the way they understand themselves. So many biographers don't do that. So many biographers bring their own biases, their own sort of overlay, and try and fit somebody into that interpretive framework. And I think so many biographies, they're often well written and interesting and good reading, but they're just wrong, or they're just completely mistaken about their conclusions and the way they unfold understanding decisions and so forth. It's not easy to do, to understand someone as they understood themselves, but you got to understand their character. The second thing I'll say is, I interviewed a lot of people for my books, especially when you're writing about a president or a prime minister. I think it's best to try and go to documents, because documents don't lie, is what I put it. It's not that people lie, but sometimes their memories fade. And here's my other rule. The more senior they are, the more they have their own reputation and versions of events to vindicate. And so, I will know from documents that someone who was in I won't name any examples just now, but I'll know somebody in Reagan's cabinet would say, oh, I thought and said X and Y, and I'll know from other people, usually more junior people, they'll tell you the truth because they don't have a stake in it, or from a document that in fact that cabinet official had the opposite view or the opposite position at the time. And so that's a problem for biographers, is you have to realize that, and you have to triangulate your sources, because otherwise you'll end up telling an incomplete or incorrect story.
Well, Steve, that's as good advice for any, for those who are looking to study perhaps with a historical eye today's events some years down the road. Steve, thanks again for joining us on Rendezvous with History. Great having you on.
Well, thank you, Anthony. It's been fun.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.